Thank you, Bethany. So I guess the sharing is not working right now. The people need to fill out the polls first. Okay, got it. All right, I'm checking out the answer boards. Well, interesting answers. Can you hear me okay, Bethany? Is the mic doing better today? Perfect. All right. All right. Let the little pot go. Can you see my screen? Oh. All right. Go ahead and start. I'm just trying to find where the little thingy were. All right. Lost it, but that's fine. Can you see my screen? All right, perfect. So thank you so much for having me here today. I have a first timer presentation here, so very excited to showcase this presentation. It was first given by Gavin Pickin at this year's Into the Box, and now I am the steward of it, about modern, function, and fluent Cold Fusion REST APIs. I guess I'm going to skip my intro because Bethany did a great job of introducing myself. Just you can find me there at Led Mahano or at Orchard Solutions if you want to follow us in Twitter. So we'll go ahead and start. Just a little quote for inspiration, thanks to Gavin. Programs must be written for people to read and only incidentally for machines to execute. I always love this quote, and it is inspiring because we have been doing so much in our tools and frameworks in order to make this a more of a reality. But in the sense, you can also apply it to your own code, and that's what we're here for today. So to give you a little bit of what we're going to be doing here today, we're not going to be building APIs from scratch in 10 minutes or something like that. We have written a full-fledged application with 6 versions of the API in its progression of refactoring into a more fluent and a more modern approach to API development. So we'll go through this age of APIs, see what is coming down the pipeline for API development, and look at the past in order to see the future in terms of how many people have been written APIs, especially in the language of Cold Fusion. Point out some guiding principles that we find essential for building APIs. And then, of course, we have created this API evolution, and we'll be sharing all this. It's available for people to fork and pull and have it available at their disposal. So to start, we have to remember that we are in the age of APIs. We're building more APIs than ever before. There are 2 distinct concerns appearing, obviously, API and frontend, and sometimes it is just API. Every company is a software company at this day and age, and we must be agile, we must be connected, and we must be sustainable. So I think it's always important to remember where we are right now in order to sustain the demand that we're getting in our software. Okay, so let's say that we're building an API that we have been tasked with, and we're calling this API version 0. And if we use some traditional approaches, then we might be doing things like hitting a Cold Fusion template page and returning JSON. Okay, that might be one approach. It works. Might not be pretty, but it works. Then you might get inspired and say, okay, I'm just going to execute a CFC file and add remote equals true and do a return format of JSON. And it works. Okay, no problem. I have satisfied my requirement. You can see here a very ugly URL, but it works. The reality is that when we're doing this type of versions of APIs, there is a lot of manual process. We only have CSCs to help us with encapsulation. That's pretty much it. But we have to do things manually. Status codes, headers, cores, queries, inline queries, dependency injection frameworks might be out the window here. No MVC, homegrown MVC, maybe an old framework. There might not even be any objects, any services or DAOs that we encapsulate our data with, right? Maybe there is no object-oriented programming in terms of how we are defining entities or resources. So this is API 0, which is basically a lot of manual work, a lot of chopping, a lot of blood, a lot of sweat, and a lot of tears. But the reality is that we have all been here, right? I have written APIs like this. Maybe you still have APIs like that. And the best thing to do is to admit it, right? You're scared when you go back to maintain them. You have cried in a dark corner. You have feel ashamed sometimes. So how can we do things differently, right? How can we take what the requirement that has been satisfied in order to also satisfy ourselves in the terms of building things modern, functional, fluent, and happy, okay? But what does this really mean? So we're going to explore this a little bit before we really delve into a lot of code, and we're going to delve into a lot of code today, okay? Now, why do you want to tackle something in this approach? Well, we want more human code, right? We want to go back to that inspiring quote and say, hey, I want to build my software in a little bit more human approach, right? I want somebody that is new to my software to come in and actually read through my source code and get it, right? I don't have to write 1,000 pages of the documentation. They can just go through my code and get it. I want to write less boilerplate code. I want to be dry, right? And I also want to focus on what it should do and not on how it should do it. And I know this is a big statement, but this is kind of the major concepts about functional programming or even BDD, right? The BDD is the behavior-driven approach to development. And we're going to be focusing a lot on this because we focus a lot on testing. And this has been one of those areas where people and developers really go to a corner and cry because they really want to test, but they have no idea how, or they think it's complicated, or they think that it's going to add so much time to their work that they will never finish. But they're all lies, okay? Now, testing will accelerate your development. It will give you confidence, but you need to understand the tooling. If you do not understand and are comfortable with the tooling, then yes, all the other statements will be true. And with that, how can we create more APIs than ever before? How can we turn around requirements easier? How can we maintain this in a much better approach than the old days, right? And one important statement is that we need to let the tools do the grunt work. You should not be doing the grunt work. The tools should be doing the grunt work, okay? And then at the end, obviously say fun, right? We also want to have fun in what we do and explore different things and actually spend the time that we want in things that actually build our development experiences. So we've kind of created these guiding principles around this development, right? We call it CREATES, which is cohesion, right? Always focus on simplicity of objects, right? That they should be doing one thing and one thing only, right? About a single responsibility. Have things that are readable, okay? Even your source code should be readable. Okay? Refactor is something that has to be ingrained because it's something that you're going to have to be doing day in and day out. And in this example today, we're going to be doing 6 refactors of the same API source code. Encapsulation. We don't want to be putting our code everywhere, right? We want to make sure that we encapsulate it in reusable components so we can be dry and we can be sustainable and extensible. Then abstractions. We want to think about abstractions. We want to be building things always on a concrete approach. We want to make sure that we can tackle what's coming into the future. And that the only way to do that is through abstractions. Okay? So if we code against abstractions, our code is a lot more flexible. And then testability. Okay? We always want to make sure that things are automated and tested. Okay? And then that will bring sanity. right? That's our last point, is that all these things in order to bring sanity into our life. That's it for slides. We're going to start getting into a lot of code here. So what we've done is we built a Twitter clone. This actually came out of some of our trainings of Coldbox Zero to Hero trainings. You can see the link right here in GitHub, okay, for Modern Functional Fluent CFML REST, a handful there. That is the source code that we're going to be seeing today. And the slides as well can be found here if you wanted to. Very simple API. We're going to be creating an API that manages rants by specific users, right? So we want to be able to create rants, to list rants, to show a rant, to delete a rant, and to update it. So in API version 1 now, what we're going to do is that we're going to create a hierarchical REST API. This is going to be based on Coldbox. Using command box, I'm going to be able to scaffold this API using the HMVC. That means hierarchical MVC. So it's going to be versioned, okay, because we're building several versions here. Okay, we're going to be using Coldbox 6 here, so we have the ability to use what's called REST handlers. So we're focusing on our code instead of the boilerplate code. And then we also have a global response object that's been given to us by Coldbox 6. And we're going to be validating inputs, and we're going to be returning errors via JSON, right? We want uniformity. We want to make sure that this is a JSON REST API. Okay? There could be other formats. And we're going to be using service objects, okay? No ORMs right now, just vanilla service objects we query execute to return query data. And of course, we're going to be doing all this in BDD. Okay? So I'm going to get out of here and go to our code. And before I could see the controls, but I don't see them anymore. So I guess I'm going to have to wait until I finish to answer some questions. So here is the GitHub repository. You can clone it. It has all the instructions on what to do with it. Okay. Here is the code. First question is, I'm going to open, let's say, just this right here. And is the font okay, or do I need to bump it up? Okay. Is that better or more? I can do a little bit more if you guys want. All right, let's try that. And if not, we'll do more. But here is our template. Okay, you can just clone it, get your database ready, run our migrations, and start a server, and you'll be up and running with the API. You'll get something like this from version 1 from the API, and that's our RESTful response. Okay, so to go through this here, we're going to go through in modules app. We've created all the different versions of this API. Okay, V1 through V6, and we're going to showcase what V1 is. And also the tests are right here. The specs are there for each of the API versions. They're there, right? And we've created scripts as well. So you can actually run the script to test each version, right? So if I wanted to test version 1, I can just run the script. It'll test V1, and it'll give me all the results in my console right here of everything that I'm doing, okay? The same I can do right here. So this is going to be tests. We have a little browser here, so I can navigate to my API v1 and run my tests for my rants, right? So right now you can see that all my tests are green, right? I've created a lot of tests for a very simple API, right? Just to give an example. But let's get through the API and how I've built it, and then we're going to start seeing the differences of working with this API. So here's the module. It has a router, so this is the URLs that it's going to inspect. And I have 2 routes. And actually, I have no routes because this is the vanilla routing that comes in Coldbox. So it's by convention. I have not created any pretty URLs right here, right? And that's it, right? I have not created anything fancy. My echo handler is basically inheriting from Coldbox REST. That means that it gives me all the facilities in order for me to produce JSON. All I have to do is talk to a response object and put some data in it. And once I do that, then I get the data in this nice uniform format that you can see here. which is has a data element, and maybe this is too small. Let me bump this one up. There's a data element, there's a messages array, there's pagination, if this actually produced records with pagination, and an error. And I can modify this as I see fit. This is just the initial work, but very easily I can come in here and say, welcome to my API RESTful service, which just doesn't make sense, but it's still, you can see here that it's there. And then if I actually go and run my tests, I haven't broken anything because I haven't tested this one through the echo one. Okay, but you can see here that this is a very simple API, nothing interesting in this case. Right? The rants is where it starts getting interesting. Okay, and we've created a few methods here. We've created a list method, a view method, a delete, a create, and a save. The traditional CRUD. Right. So if we go through each of these, you see at least I'm using dependency injection. So I have some services that I've built, right? A rant and a user service. You can see, and we follow here return of list of rants, right? We have a rant service, and we say, give me a list of rants, and then put them into the. So if we want to actually see this guy, I can go to API v1 rants, right? And it's called list. So remember, no beautiful URLs, just the traditional URLs. And you can see here that it produces the data. It produces the data of row count 22 columns and the data. So you obviously you can see that this is a query, right? And it's not very beautiful, right? It doesn't produce very nice data, but it produces the data, right? I can go massage it later, but I fill my requirement. There it is. The data is there, right? If I wanted to view one, well, I would have to go to a rant view, and then I would actually have to pass in the rant ID, let's say let's say 7, and then it gives me the data of that specific rant. Okay, so just showing you 2 endpoints, and you can see here this is only the handler code, right? This was the list. This is the view where I'm checking if I passed in a rant ID. If I did not pass in rant ID, I need to produce an error. If the rant ID is not numeric, I have to produce an error. Then I have to get the rant, and if it doesn't exist, then I also produce an error, and so forth. So a lot of boilerplate code that you can see for the different actions. Okay, I'm not going to go through every single line of code, just to show you that it's written. Okay, you can see that one. You can see the save operation. Oh my gosh, right? I had to write all this, right? Which is I'm doing all this self-validation just to make sure that the incoming data satisfies my requirements, right? If not, I have to produce all these erroneous exceptions. And that's it, right? That's a simple CRUD handler. And now imagine if you had, this is one endpoint. Imagine if you had 10 endpoints, 20 endpoints. That's a lot of boilerplate, right? A lot of code, right? Let's look at our service. Our service, let's look at the rant service. The rant service is a little bit cleaner. You can see that doesn't have a lot of code. It's using query execute, very simple. On my list, I just do a simple query. On my get rant, I just get another query when a specific rant ID, delete, create, and update. So it's fairly clean. No problem here at this area. And that's pretty much it. This is our API v1, right? It has 2 service objects that I work with, and it has no routes defined, and it has a lot of code in it for validation, a lot of code to making sure the results are correct, and basically populating this response object to get some data back, right? Let's see if I pass in no rant ID. It tells me that the rant ID is required, right? Error equals true. Right? If it doesn't find it, then it goes in there. Then it didn't even find that when I'm making mistakes, right? So the API works, and I can publish this, okay? Maintaining it, that's a different story, right? So let's say that I'm done, but I sent this for code review, and they go through my code and they say, you know what, we found so many things that we can do for improvement. So they come up and say, okay, let's work on version 2 of this API. And instead of this convention routing, I want to actually adhere to the RESTful architecture of endpoints. So I've created, I want you to refactor to modern rounding instead of the conventions. I don't want queries. Okay, they look ugly, they look nasty, especially if we're going to be working with a modern JavaScript framework, right? So just change everything to array of structs, please. Okay, and refactor the gets to use structs instead of queries as well, right? I don't want to deal with queries right now. And you know what? There's this validation library. It's called CV validation. So why don't you use the library instead of you building all the manual validations? Okay? And then instead of doing more queries for existence of records, why don't you just encapsulate that in an exist function and also create getter functions so they can be a lot consistent instead of all just these queries everywhere. And of course, more BDD tests. So I take all that knowledge, and what we're going to do is we're going to build V2. And V2 is going to produce the same thing, but we're going to start comparing how we evolve this, this application. So let's look at the routers first, right? And let's compare them, right? So we can see that the convention was just there. And what we've added is that we've added our own routes. So we've added a specific post with a nice rants create that it will execute rants.create. We have a route for delete. You can see here that goes to rants delete. We have another route for saving operations, and we have a get, right, for a specific show, and then another route for the different lists, right? So I've created all these routes, and then in Callbox, we also have a nifty little tool that I can go in here and say, I want to see the route visualizer. And here it gives me all the registered routes in my system. Here's API v2, so I can open the router for that module. And I can see here all the routes that I've defined, and I can look at them and say, okay, they look good to me. Okay, this is much better than what I had before. So this looks good. So those are my routes. I've made that improvement. I'm going to go look at my rant service because I didn't want to be producing queries, right? So let's compare them. And what you can see here is that now I'm going to take a query and then I'm going to reduce it. So now I'll start applying a little bit of functional programming, okay? Because I'm going to take this query and then I'm going to reduce it into an array. And all I do is say, okay, I am going to grab that row and I'm going to append it to my array and then return it, and so forth and so forth. This functional approach knows how to iterate through the query. And then this list is now going to be returning an array of structures instead of a query. If you look at the get operation, the same thing happens. Is a functional approach. Instead of returning an array, I want a struct of that representation. So right here, I will reduce it to a structure as I see fit. Okay, and that's pretty much it. The update, I just, oh, I didn't know why I did that one. And here's my exists. So in my exists, I just pass in an ID, and then I return a Boolean format out of a query if it has any length, right? And if it does, then it means that that rant ID exists in my system. If not, it doesn't exist, right? So I've added those modifications that my code review process told me to, okay? And I feel very satisfied with that. And now let's look at our rants, how they look now. So let me compare them now. Where'd it go? Compare. And we started doing a little bit more modifications here. So you can see here that I don't have to set a rant, right? Why do I need to set that variable? I just don't need to. So I'm going to be a little bit more fluent, and I'm not going to be creating any states. So I just talk to my response object, and I say, hey, here's a list. Here we go. Here's a view. You can see now I have all this boilerplate. And what I'm going to do with CV validation is define rules. So I can say, hey, I want you to validate. So this function, this special function, appeared out of nowhere because validation injected it, right? So there we go. CV validation to the rescue. I can say validate. Here's the request context, all the data that comes in, and here are my rules, right? So make sure that a rant ID is required and it is numeric. And if there's any exceptions, then set an error message and you're done, okay? So I was able to refactor a little bit, shorten my display here. I can get a specific rant now that is a structure. So instead of getting a length out of the query, I just actually make sure that it's not an empty structure. And then I can actually present my data, right? So, and then the delete is the same, right? I start refactoring the validations into these rules. And I start looking at where I can save on state. And my API is a little bit better. You can see all that boilerplate on the left for a save operation is replaced with 3 lines of constraints, right? So I'm cleaning it up. I'm making it more maintenance free, right? As I move on, and there we go. I finished my CRUD right here. I can show you a little bit of how it looks now, since it's an array of structs now. So if I go to v2 rants, you can see that now I have all my data right here, okay, being represented. Okay, and I have a 21 of those, and here we go. Okay, nothing fancy. Okay, but I have completely changed that. I can go look at my tests and say, okay, I want to execute v2 now. Make sure that all my tests are passing now that I've refactored all this source code. And there we go. All my tests are passing. Okay. So all the things that I've refactored into this new API approach with validation, with a little bit of more nicer error messages, and not creating any states, but just passing things directly to functions. And my API is looking a lot nicer. Okay. So I go back and I say, okay, I've done all my changes. I'm on V2, and I send it back to code review, right? So I sent it back to code review. All my tests are passing, and I get more changes. I'm like, oh my God, why? So, and here's the input that I get. Well, instead of you creating all those manual routes, why don't you use this concept of resourceful routes? And resourceful routes is common around MVC frameworks in any language. And it basically determines that a route should have uniformity. Okay, so it's less boilerplate again. Okay, so by creating a resourceful route, you're guaranteed that all your routes are going to be very uniform, depending on which endpoint you have. Okay, just the endpoint names change. So that gives you uniformity. Somebody coming from Ruby on Rails, or somebody coming from Grails, or somebody coming from Laravel, they will all know what this is. Okay, so that's a plus. Okay? Then I also want to introduce a base service. You know what? I'm going to be creating more of these endpoints, and I'm sure that I'm going to have more services. So why don't I do a little bit of encapsulation and abstraction to prepare for the future, and move the exists into the base service, and introduce these concepts of exists or fail, right? Because I'm seeing that I'm doing a lot of if statements, right? If this does not exist, then throw an exception. If this does not exist, then do something else. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my job a little bit easier and create a method that if it exists, it will return a Boolean, or it will fail and throw an exception. We'll have a get that will retrieve a record, and if it doesn't exist, I will fail. Okay, and I also noticed that validation has a similar approach. On CV validation, there is a validate or fail. So I can take that and I will basically fail automatically, and the framework will take care of those exceptions for me in a nice uniform way. So let's go back now, and I've created now version 3. So let's go through version 3 and see how this API has been refactored and evolved thanks to this code review. So I'm going to start with my router, of course, and I'm going to compare them. And here's the difference, right? On the left-hand side, I've created all these routes manually. Okay. On the right-hand side, I use this resources method that is available to me. And I just say, okay, what is the name of your resource? Rants. What is the parameter that you're expecting for incoming data? Rant ID. Okay. And then do you want to, since this is a RESTful API, and this is not a traditional HTML application, I want to do exceptions. So I don't want a new or an edit resource to be created because this is an API. Okay. So by me doing this resources, I can check it out on my nifty Route Explorer, and I can close this router now, and I can go to V3. So V3 is right here. And V3 creates these nice uniform resourceful routes. It creates a rant ID, okay, and that will map to a rant handler, and it will pivot depending on the HTTP method. Great. Now I'm hearing even more to the standards of RESTful architecture because I'm using these HTTP methods. And I'm saying when I get a delete, go to delete. When I get a get, go to the show action. When I get a put, go to the update action. When there's a patch, go to the update action. If I just go to rants, then go to the rants. But if I do a post, it goes to create. If I do a get, it goes to index. Okay? And this will be the same for any resource that I create in my system. So uniformity, check. Okay. And just with that line, I get all these routes available to me in a very standard and uniform way. Now, you can see here that I've created a base service. This is new. I had not created it before. It has a little bit more boilerplate because I am creating things via modules, right? But it has a constructor. So basically, I'm telling it to which entity, to which table, and primary key I'm going to be working with, right? So it's like my mini ORM here, okay? And then I've created an exists function that basically just makes sure that I can select an ID from a specific table name and the primary key is equal to an incoming value. And if it does exist, then it exists. And if it exists or fails, then I just check if it exists. And then if not, I throw an exception called entity not found. Okay, I made that up, entity not found. This entity was not found. And here's a get or fail, which will actually call a concrete implementation of a get. And if the entity is not empty, right, then it returns it. If it is empty, then I do the same. Okay, so I'm doing all this work just to make it a little bit more fluent. Okay, so let me close the base service and let's look at the rant service again and see how that was modified in this version. So if I compare them now, you will see that they, first of all, inherit from the base service. Okay, and here's my constructor. I just say, okay, I'm going to be dealing with rants. This is the table name. This is the parameter name, and here's the entity. Okay? A list doesn't change a bit. It just changed in formatting. Okay, I was using CF format at that time, so you can see how it changed it through CF format. The same here. Okay, nothing has changed. I just actually cleaned up the arrow function to be in the one line. Okay, the create stays the same, right? Just formatting. And exists, I removed. Okay, so in all reality, all I did was inherit, prepare a constructor, and remove some stuff. That's it. All right, so now let's look at the handler and let's see how that evolved through this line of refactoring. So first of all, I'm using v3. My index now becomes index instead of list. Okay, subtle change, but now I'm adhering to the resources. Okay, so my index now will be the same. My view becomes a show, and look at all the boilerplate that is gone right now. Okay, right now I just say validate or fail. So all the data comes in, that it gets validated, and if not, fails. And then I know that my data is valid, so then I can get or fail that specific rant ID from my rant service and set it into my data. And that's it. So I don't have all that to create anymore, right? I've cleaned this up because I'm becoming a little bit more fluent and creating these methods that can either validate or throw exceptions. And all these exceptions bubble up to my REST handler that will take care of those exceptions, right? So to show you that working, right, I can go back here and I can go to v3 and I still get my rants, right? Let's say right now I want to show, I have to just pass an ID and there's row 0. The record cannot be requested because it doesn't exist. So you see it through an exception, right? That one doesn't exist. Let me go to one that exists and there's the record that exists. Okay. So all that is manipulated via these lines of code right here. Okay. Oops. So a big difference, right? My handlers look a lot nicer right now. I don't have to be creating a lot of code just to validate some things. My unit tests actually stay pretty much the same, but the surface area that I have to work with is a lot less. And if I had code coverage turned on, I'd probably have 100% coverage here now. So it is very interesting that these subtle changes have cleaned up so much code, as you can start seeing here, right? I start seeing my handlers, right? So let's look at this one here for creating a new rant. I validate or fail. Then I make sure that the user ID that I want to attach to exists or fails, right? Then I actually create my specific rant, and then I set the data and the message, and I don't have to be doing all this that I'm doing right here. And I'm beautifying my RESTful service. All right. So I finished this, and let's see my test run. Right, so I'm going to go to v3 now. Okay, and I'm going to execute my tests. Okay. Hopefully they will all pass. But I will close this, and I'm going to be ready to submit this for further approval to my team. And there, all my tests are passing, and I submit v3 And yet, once again, I think that I'm done, but I'm not. So I submit my V3, and they come back to me even with more changes for API v4. So in API v4, the instructions that I receive is that they want to create entities or objects to better visualize the data. Right now, everything has been doing through an array of structs, and they want actually an encapsulated object for behavior. Okay, because first of all, they want to produce case sensitivity instead of ugly uppercases that are coming from all these queries, right? Which are nasty. It makes JavaScript developers go nuts. Why is everything in uppercase? Why is everything in uppercase? Okay, so I don't want uppercase. I want my own casing, right? I also want to be able to encapsulate validation, not in my handlers, but in my entities. And you know what? I want to produce or convert an object into data by creating a nice method called getMemento, right? Because I want to be able to test or unit test that I can convert an entity to data. Okay. Now, I also want to be able to populate or inflate objects from incoming data, right? And you know what? I'm going to add a pre-handler validation also for more encapsulation, because right now I'm still doing my constraint validation everywhere. Right? So I'm like, okay, API v4, here we go. Let's see how this one goes. And I start opening it up, and let's see what I've done for v4. Right? So let's start, of course, with our router, and let's compare a router. Hello? Mm-hmm. You can do it right now. It's okay. Oh, but we gotta stop, right? Actually, let's do it now. Mm-hmm. All right, cool. All right, so can you still see my screen? Oh, okay, perfect. Okay. All right, perfect. So I'm going to go and now compare this V3 to V4 and see how I've refactored this. Now, I was reading through some of the comments there, and you think that I'm flipping too fast on some of these things. And the reality is that I am, right? And on purpose, because I'm not going to go through every single line of code. We're going to be here for a week. So this code is available to you. You can get through it, you can digest it, and you can wrap your head around it, okay? The idea is for you to know how the API process of refactoring takes place, so then you can do it on your own time if you're interested, right? But here we go for the comparison of the routers. The routers are the same. Nothing will change in that aspect. Okay, so I can close the routers. Let's look at the base service. The models. The models are expanding now, right? So I actually have objects that represent my data. So I can see here a user object. And remember, there's no ORM here. There's pure object orientation with queries. I model a user. Okay, I've created this isLoaded function to help me know if a user has been loaded from the database or not by looking at the ID. So if the ID exists and it has some type of length, then I can use it. To retrieve the data of this object as a memento, okay, and you can look at what a memento design pattern is, but it's basically just retrieving the state of an object. I can create another struct right here to represent the state of the object. And I'm here getting the data out of my object. Here's my rent. Okay, I can also use dependency injection and retrieve a service from here. You can see in my first change is that I've moved some validation constraints into my object. by creating this nifty little this.constraints. This comes from CB validation, right? I can add my constraints to my object. I say this body and this user ID are required, okay? And the user ID must be numeric. I have a constructor. I have a method to retrieve a user, which actually talks to the user service and say, hey, give me the user that is represented by this user ID. I have another isLoaded function, okay, to verify this object. And I have another get memento. And there we go. It produces the memento for this rant. Okay? Now, let me close those and I'll go to the rant service and do a comparison of those and see how those have evolved. So they've evolved quite a bit. You can see here that I have a new method called new, which actually is going to be providing me rant objects. So this basically is just a way for me to create objects. You can see my list has changed dramatically. You can see here that I've introduced a list array function that still does my query and reduces it to an array of structs. But then I grab that array of structs and I convert them by using another functional approach called map. Okay, so a map function will take any item in a list and return something new and give you back a new list. Okay, in this case, I'm going to take that specific struct and I'm going to populate a new object from that data. So at the end of the day, I'm going to have an array still, but it's going to be an array of objects instead of an array of those structs. My get operation is the same, except now on returning just a traditional struct, it's going to be returning a nice little object encapsulating everything that I need. And the rest pretty much stays the same, but you can see now that the create has changed. And this might be a very subtle change, but it's a very important change. You can see that before I had a create with the body and the user ID that I needed to create a new rant with. On the right, I just have the object that defines or models the rant. Now, the right-hand side is 10,000 times more flexible than the one on the left, and here's why. If I give you a requirement to add 4 more columns into a rant, you're going to be modifying this service API method plus the update, plus I'm pretty sure all the different things that work with that properties. So I'm touching a lot of code just for adding a few added properties into that rant. Okay. On the right-hand side, if I say, okay, I want to add 4 more properties or 50, it doesn't matter because they're going to be encapsulated inside of the rant object. And if I tell you, hey, Luis, what is inside of a rant, then you can go into the object instead of here on the left. There is no concept of an object of a rant. I have to basically go through code to figure out what I need in order to get a rant. So a lot more maintainable, a lot more usable, and a lot more working on abstractions than before. Okay. So now when I get this rant object, you can see that my SQL stays pretty much the same. The only difference is that I'm getting the values out of that object. Okay. And then I do the same for the update. You can see here that I only received the rant. I don't have to be worried about the different unique properties. Okay. And then let's look at how my handler changed. Okay. So if I go compare this guy now, let's look at the difference. Well, right now, if you can see here on the left-hand side, I had this validator fail for this rant ID on the show, on the delete, and on the create, and on the update. Okay, I had all these validations for that specific rant ID. So what I decided to do is just create a pre-handler, so an action that fires before any action, and I can tag it with which ones I want. So I say for show, for delete, and update, please execute. So right here, I put my validation. Okay, so I take it out of those actions. Instead of writing that 3 times, I'm writing it once. Okay, and once I receive an exception from this, then just process it through the validation exception action. Okay, and then I start looking at my other methods. Instead of just saying list, I'm gonna also use a map here. And I'm gonna say I'm gonna convert this now again to the memento, okay? The representation that I want out of these objects, okay? And this one is the same, it's just adding those memento calls. The delete now looks a lot nicer because I removed all the boilerplate. The same for the creates, okay, and for the updates. So I'm doing a lot better. My handler is becoming really nicer and compact. And if I actually go execute, let me just remind you how V3 rants look like. Okay, this is how V3 looks like. And if I look at V4, how they look now, look at the casing. Look at the casing, which is very important for JavaScript frameworks. I don't have to be dealing with ugly uppercase anymore. Okay, now I can choose which case I want for the representations that I want. Okay, and very nicely now I can actually return what I need. It's extremely fast and performant still, and I have my versions, and I can run all my tests for my API right here, and then go execute it. Okay, and there it is. This time it did it really, really fast. Okay, and all my tests pass. Right. So I finished with V4. Okay, and I know we have about 15 minutes left, so hopefully we'll get to see the other ones. But I send it again for code review, and they come back to me a little bit more. And they tell me, hey, we see in your handlers you're doing a lot of setters. Why don't you use this handy little method called populate model, so you don't have to be doing this manually. So don't do this manually. And then they also tell me, look, there's another module called the Mementifier that will actually build all those mementos for you, so you don't have to be doing that manually. So stop building manual data, right? Just use something that is already available for you. Okay, all right, fine. I also see that you created a new method on each of these services. Why don't you encapsulate that in the base service and let the base service deal with it? Okay. Now, also that update and create, why don't you return the entity that you're creating and that you're updating? Because maybe we can create some functional approaches to the data instead of always, just returning a true or false. Okay. And why don't we, in the base entity, why don't we add all these methods in there to create encapsulation again, right? I think you're creating too much in your services. Let's clean up the services as well in this version. So let's start with version 5 and see how we have evolved now from version 4. Okay, so we can start always with the router, and you will see that they are the same. Okay, nothing has changed in the routing. Okay, good. We can close that router. Let's move to our models. Let's start there. We can see here our rant. So let's see if we did any modifications in our rant. Okay, and we can see here that I think I put them in the wrong order. Let me go rant here and rant here. Compare. Okay, now it did it. So V4 is on the left, V5 is on the right. So you can see here that now I have created a little bit more additions to my constraints. And in the user ID, in my handler, I was always checking for existence. So why do I do that also in the validation? Because that's part of the validation. So you can see here on the right, let me expand this, that the user ID is required. It has to be numeric. And then I attach a UDF for validation. So this will be called for me and executed for me at runtime. And I say, okay, if the argument of value is null or is not numeric, return false. And then I also call my user service and I check for the existence of that value. Okay? So all this I'm encapsulating in my constraint instead of doing things manually. Okay? I've also created a base entity. So now I'm abstracting things a little bit more. You can see here that I have still an init. I still have a get user. But I removed the memento, and I removed the is loaded. Okay, so now I'm taking that code and encapsulating it into a base object to provide as a family for all these objects. Okay? So we can do the same for the rant and check out the rant object. So rant number 4 and 5, and compare those, and you can see the same. Right here's oh, I did the rant. Sorry, it was the user one. User. Okay. You can see here that the user on the right is a lot more simple, which just has a constructor. Okay, I have removed all that. Okay? And now we can look at a base entity. So this base entity I have introduced. Okay, I have introduced this concept of memento. Okay, you read the documentation for it. But what it says is I want to be able to marshal or convert all the properties inside of an object, but never include the password, the primary key, or the entity name, or the service name, or the module name, or the entity service, right? I have created a constructor just to help me with the construction of entities. I have wired it with the specific service object to deal with that entity. I have my isLoaded, so every entity will have an isLoaded. I have a populate, so I can populate every entity, and this comes from the ColdBox populator. And I also have a validator fail, so I added a nice little helper for me, so I can actually validate the data or fail right from the entity. And I can also save the entity or delete the entity itself. So it's kind of looking like a mini ORM because I'm building all this boilerplate over and over again. Why am I going to be building it over and over again? So I can just encapsulate it in a nice little object. And every entity will have this available for me. Okay? So you can even see here the save operation looks if the object is loaded. If the object is loaded, then it updates it. If it's not, then it goes create a new record. Okay? And that's the base entity. So that's completely new. Let's see if the base service has changed in this version. So we're going to change our here comparison. And we can see here the difference is that we modified the new because we were adding this on every service. And instead, we encapsulated into the base. So every service will have the ability to create a new object. And I can even pass some data and populate that object with that data to return it back. Okay. That's it. No more changes in this area. And then finally, we can go back to our handler. Okay, and we can compare how it looks now. Okay, and we can see a little bit more dramatic changes here. So we can start here. We can see that this is just the injection that changes. Let's look at our show. Our show just, I did a little bit of formatting just to make it a little bit nicer and readable. Okay, remember, human readable. And now let's look at our delete. Before we had an exist or fail, then we called the delete on that specific RAN ID, and then we added a message. What we've done here now is we've done a Fluent call. That means that it completely is chainable right here. We just say RAN service, get or fail this ID, and then if you retrieve it, then delete it. And then the rant is deleted. Okay? Very readable, a lot better than before. Let's look at our create. Here on the left, we had a new object called rant. Then we validated the incoming data with those constraints. Then we manually checked for the user ID to make sure that it existed. Then we set the body, we set the user ID into that rant object, and we sent it for being saved, and we presented the response. In our new approach, we basically say rant service, I want to create a new object out of the incoming data, then validate that object or fail it, and then if it validates, then save it. And then we present our data. Very fluent, very nice, just a few lines of code that I can follow. Okay? Look at our update. Our update looked similar. Okay? And now I say rant service, I want you to get or fail according to this RAN ID that I received. I want you to populate with this incoming data, but I want you to exclude the ID, okay, in case they want to manipulate the ID. And then I want you to validate or fail it, and then I want you to save it. Okay. So with a nice Fluent approach, I'm able to retrieve and have exceptions if I cannot retrieve it. I can populate the data using my security exclusions. I can validate the data or fail it, and then I can send it to be saved. And then I save it. Okay. So a lot of improvements for this V5. So let's go back and execute it, make sure that it executes. Here's V4, here's V5. Still producing the same kind of data. Okay. And if I go execute my tests, they execute pretty fast. In 1.5 seconds, I've executed all these to make sure that all my data is passing. Okay. I still haven't showed you any of the tests, but I will leave that at the end if there's still time. All right, so I'm very satisfied with V5. I have made a tremendous amount of improvements, and I'm gonna send this now to code review. Okay. So I send this to code review, and they come up with another version. And they say, you know what? You're almost done, but let's add a few things. I see the boilerplate that you have for the pre-handler. And you know what? What if we have 10 resources? Are you going to be creating that for all those 10 resources? Why don't we just bind the parameter in the resource with a specific type. That way, you don't have to be dealing with that, and it will just be an invalid route, right? So, okay, fine. So, if it's going to be invalid route, make sure you catch all these invalid routes and present a nice message telling the user that that route is not valid. Okay, great. I also want you to add event caching because this is going to be a very mission critical application hit by thousands of users, millions of users. So let's add some type of caching into your RESTful service. Okay. And finally, I need you to document the API. And I'm like, oh, Lord, documentation. Well, don't be afraid. We created a CD Swagger, which gives you the ability to create Swagger docs right in line in your handlers, and then be able to actually import that data into things like Postman or Swagger.io, and all your documentation will be there. All right, that one made me a little bit excited, so let's go on with the show for V6, our final version. So let's start with our router. We're gonna compare our routers. And you can see here that on the right, we've modified the routing a bit. We've basically added our echo at the top to signify that that's an entry point. I've moved our resources, and I binded the parameter with a specific type by adding a dash numeric. And this is part of Callbox, and you can add many bindings, or you can even add your own regular expressions if you wanted to. And this basically says the only way I'm going to route is if this rant ID is numeric. If not, I will ignore it, and I will go to the next route, which is match anything, and that will go into a non-invalid route. Okay? I don't have to be writing any boilerplate anymore about rant ID not being numeric. I'm just going to send it to an invalid route. Okay? So if we actually look at our handlers now, which is most of the changes, this is how it looks, because our services all stayed intact. First of all, I got rid of this boilerplate on the left, okay? Because now I am doing the route matching, so this is gone. And then I'm actually adding documentation into my actions. So I'm adding a little route notification to explain to people that if you do a get on this API URL, then you can get to this specific action. I describe what you are going to be doing, and I actually attach a response, in this case of 200, and I map it to a location called API-v6 rants index responses.json, to this magical path. Now, this magical path is by convention, and is found in a folder called resources, okay? API docs, API v6, rants, and then you can see here index. And then here I can actually see the responses, and I can see an example 200. So here is the CB Swagger documentation for this endpoint, right? I can see here for a response for a 200, I will do a list of agents, and here's all that information, right, for the rant. Here's an example 200, okay? And I can start basically adding all these data right here in my resources. So when I actually document this, I will have a very nice documentation set for CB Swagger. Okay. So let's look at other ones here. Here's a show. A show will have parameters, right? Because we do have parameters here. They map to a parameters.json. Okay. For parameters, we also have a 200 response or a 404. Okay, that are mapped as well. We can see a delete here, which has the same thing. It has parameters. It has a response of 200 or a 404. And there's here another response with 200 and a response of 400. And I can be adding all the Swagger metadata into my handlers, right? That when I actually go into my API and I go to the CB Swagger endpoint, this produces the entire CB Swagger documentation. Okay? So right here, CB Swagger documented my full API. I have my information right here, my servers for development, and all the different paths. And you can see that it's smart enough to detect all the APIs. Okay. Now you can be very explicit and decide which APIs you want to document, but you can see it right here. Let me actually expand. Collapse all. Here are my paths. You can see that I documented everything. Okay. V6 is the only one I've documented, but all the rest ones, it tries to find out if I can document it on their own. So here's our rants. You can see here that has a post and a get, okay, just like we've created in our resources. Here's our get. Here's the operation ID, the X route. Here's my responses. So you can see here, there's the default and the 200 response. There's the description and the content that will be produced, which is application.json. Here's an example of the data. Here's a schema of the data, and so forth and so forth. So CB Swagger is a really amazing tool for me to write everything that I need to for this API. And I can grab this JSON and I can go to swagger.io and I can drop it in here, right? And here it is, my Fluent API for SourceBlock Trigger Clone. Of course, there's going to be errors because all the V2s and the V anything, I have not declared anything for them. But it creates the full documentation for this API right here. So you can see here API v6 rants for the different operations. Here's a get operation. You can see it right here. What is the rant ID you want to show that is required? Here's the code for the 200, the response for the 404 response. You can try it out if you wanted to. So I have now the ability to import this into Swagger.io and create all this nice documentation. Right? I can also go into Relax, which is another module that ships with my API endpoint. And right here, you can see that it actually created the documentation for my API, right? I can look at all the APIs that are mapped here. Here's my Fluent one. I can load it, and here is the full documentation as well, just like in Swagger.io. Okay, here's my API v6. You can see if there's any methods, there's for anything, there's for the rants, there's the method for get, right? And you start seeing the same type of documentation, right, for that. And I can also take that same data and go to a tool like Postman or Insomnia. So here's Postman, and I can say I want to import my CB Swagger document. And here it is. You can see the confirming the import, all the different schema examples, and I can just import. And here it is. Here's my Fluent API. There's my API, all the different versions. There's V6. There's my rants, right? Here is my rants index, right, where I can actually get all my data, right? Here's my post to create one. Here's the rant ID where I can delete that one, get that one, put that one, or patch that one. So fully documented. I can just copy and put it in import into Postman, and I can even build a full integration test suite from here from Postman as well. So just by adding a few lines of documentation, taking the time to look at your responses and your requests, then you're off into documentation land. Okay? Now, there are many things that I could do in our journey here to keep on expanding on V6. Like I said, all the source code is available to you, okay, in this URL right here. Okay, I'll leave it there for a bit so you guys can touch it, okay, which is github.com/elmahano/modern-functional-fluent-dfml-rest. All the API versions are there, so you can try them out. All the test suites are there. They're very expansive test suites. All testing everything in integration aspects for you to work with this API. Okay. And let me go and finish the slides here. So that was V6, but there's many other things that we could cover, right? There could be things like by using an ORM, how to abstract that. If I'm using quick ORM, how do I abstract all the queries? I can use CB Security or CB Guard to provide security now for my API. I can use CB Security for JSON Web Tokens for stateless authentication. I can add a CI workflow so you can actually see when I commit all the different tests executing and the production of those docs. I can even produce that Swagger docs and actually post it as an artifact, okay, a linting, formatting, many other things that now open to me because I have all these facilities created for this. Now, like I said, all the source code is available. You can get through it, you can run it, you can digest it, you can see the steps that we've taken from version 1 to version X and work with it. But just to leave you with how it looks like on its own, it's very, here's the rants handler. Very functional. You can see that the lines of code are 5 or 7 for each of those actions in comparison to where we started. So very nice indeed. Yes, I'm done actually. So we can move to questions now if needed. So I have about 15 more minutes for questioning, or people want to see something else different here, but we can transition to questions now. Okay, sure. I actually can't see the screen anymore, Bethany, there for some reason. Hmm. Yeah, I'm not seeing it. Let me open another browser window for it and see if it works. I wanted to answer any other questions, but I'm not seeing it there. Or if not, let me close it down and unlock my game. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. Questions. Questions. Where are these? Uh, oh, the Q&A section. Is that where they're going to post questions? Wish root. All right, can you guys hear me here? They caught my audio in the other one.
Hello, Luis.
Hey, am I with us?
Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you. Let me put my headset in here because I have to switch here. Give me 1 second. All right, now I can hear you. Can you talk about us?
Yeah, I was just saying thank you. Great presentation.
Okay, perfect. Great. Yeah, for some reason they caught my audio. And it's kind of hard to answer questions without audio. But
Well,
if you guys have any questions, I'm available for a few more minutes here, so we can chat if you need to.
I do have one question I posted there, which is, what's your recommendation on populating and validating entity objects? Are you saying it's okay to populate them and then validate them, or the other way around?
Well, you know what? I'm kind of used to just populating an object, and if the object doesn't validate, then I discard it, right? Um, there's sometimes people where they actually validate the incoming data through the RC, and that's okay. You basically just end up doing twice the work. Most of the populations comes through setters, which usually, are just setting the state into the object. They're not really persisting anything, so I find they are harmless.
Okay.
So I tend to basically don't do double validation, but I just populate my object, and even if the object can't be populated, it will fail. Right.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
No. I even got cut off of the other thing, so I can't even see the other questions that were there. But if you guys have more questions, I can answer.
What approach do you recommend for getting started? I've been a Cold Fusion developer for a long, long time and have done some service work, but have never used ColdBox. I like the approach. Have a bunch of questions around security, but work with a team who are, most of my team are basically junior developers, and being able to segment the dev cycle and always having an interest in Cold Fusion anyway. My head's swimming on where to really begin.
Yeah, definitely. So we're actually building a master class right now for this, right, to really help people through videos. So we have several of them now, and we're going to be posting them real soon. We actually launched cfcast.com today, and we're going to be putting all these casts and videos here. And that will be, I would say, one of the interesting things is to put them here, right? And then you can learn from videos. But the documentation has a lot in here. I would say if you're starting out, the Getting Started Guide or the 60-minute quick start is a great way to get you comfortable with the concept of MVC, right? Now, building things or building your objects in a more object-oriented way, that's another story, right? ColdBox basically helps you just talk to your objects and then work with them. But the Getting Started Guide and the 60-minute quick start, we've done a lot of time just to help people there. But the videos are coming soon, and you're going to find them in CFcasts and learn a lot more from a junior's perspective as well.
Cool. I appreciate it.
We also have our Slack team that you can go to. So if you go to boxteam.heroku app, you can join our Slack, and everybody's really helpful and really active to help, especially people that are coming new.
Oh, what's the name? What's the name of the Slack team?
Boxteam.heroku app, and I'll put it on the chat here as well. So,
okay, cool.
Chat here. Yeah, you can join there, and that's our Box Team chat, and we have many chats for all the different products that we work with, and we'll help you and support you there as well.
I don't see you sending in the chat.
Say it again, sorry?
I didn't see you send that link into the chat.
Oh, it's right here in there's a chat there. You can see here, boxteamherokuapp.com.
Okay.
Tom said, what file do you use in CB to generate the Swagger docs? All right, so for Swagger, you have to install CB Swagger, right? Which is just say install CB Swagger, right? Install CB Swagger in command box. That downloads the module, and all you basically do with it is add your annotations to it. There's a specific setting in your ColdBox config for CB Swagger, which you can see here in the module settings, where you define basically, kind of top level information for CB Swagger. But the rest is introspective, right? So we'll introspect all your handlers and all your resource information for API docs to build all the documentation for you.
How would you go about authenticating the CRUD operations?
So for authentication, we have CB Security built in. So that's another module. Here is actually we've created our new REST templates that are fully authenticated. So right here's our vanilla REST template. We ship it with a user and a user service to help you out. And it comes with CB Security. So in the box.json, you will see that you have CB Security. And we've also created the handler for authentication. So you can see very easily right here, you have a login, which is based on JWT, so JSON Web Tokens. You attempt to log in somebody, you get a token, and then you send that token back. And then all the security is integrated with CB Security. So the full starter template is there available for you to start working with JWT.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll send you the link here for ColdBox Security for all the JWT services. We've done a lot for JWT. And, oops, I was sending everything to Tom. Hold on, everyone in the meeting. Oh, that's why people were not seeing the link. I was sending everything to Tom.
Yeah, you're not sending in the chat.
Sorry, man. I just saw that. There we go. Tom got it.
Okay.
But there's the JWT services, and here's the link for the REST template.
Luis, you're doing another CB security session in a couple of weeks, right?
I am. So I will be doing a webinar. If we go to here, events, webinars. I'm doing a webinar on May 29th. So if you want to register, you can find the link here. And I will only be focusing on security for APIs. So basically, I'll go through this REST template. I'll clone it. I'll get through it. And then I'll connect it to an actual database. And then I'll just try to implement as much as I can. It'll be very informal, just to kind of like a little coding session and ask questions. I think people, I don't want to prepare something because I know that a lot of people have questions. So I prefer to take questions, code them, take questions, code them, and do kind of like a pair programming kind of approach to this webinar.
No, excuse me, not familiar with the ColdBox. Is the front end using CodeFusion as well?
Say that again.
The ColdBox, the front end using CodeFusion as well?
Depends. You can do whatever you want, right? Like say, for example, this CFCast, the entire front end is built on Vue. It's all Vue.js, but it's all powered by ColdBox. Okay. So you have options now, right? If you want to build the front ends with ColdFusion, you can. Or if you want to use another technology, then the API will help you there.
All right. Thank you. How's the learning curve for the ColdBox?
Well, you will have to try it and let me know. I know it by heart, but we have a 60-minute quick start right here, and we have a getting started guide. You can check that out, but it would be depending also how comfortable you are with ColdFusion, right? If you've never used components or things of that nature, it's a lot harder, right? Because you need to learn the way components work. But if you already know Cold Fusion, have been doing it, then within 60 minutes you can get an app, a RESTful app, up and going, and you can get up and started. Right?
Yeah, we actually using Cold Fusion for a long time. The backend we are using Cold Fusion's front we use Angular.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we have another application. The Flash is it's gone. We need to select a technology to hook up with our backend of Cold Fusion.
Yeah.
Right
yeah.
now.
Definitely try it out. I mean, Coldbox, this has been out for more than 14 years. So we know our stuff.
Oh.
We've been doing it for a long time. So we'll
Okay.
support you. We'll help you.
All right.
I know we didn't cover testing in the presentation, but
Yes.
it looked like you were using TestBox.
That is correct.
And I'm wondering if, so I'm excited to see that and very curious to find out more, but I'm kind of curious, do you use it just for apps that you're building in this framework, or is it more widely usable as a test framework?
It's a test framework. So TestBox basically when I created it was a direct replacement for MX Unit, but you can use it for any application. This can be a Coldbox, non-Coldbox, you name it. As long as it is Cold Fusion, it will work.
Okay, cool.
So I see Matt here asked a question about, I know the session is focused on REST, but was curious of your thoughts on it, on how organizations are moving to GraphQL. So I know that GraphQL has gotten a lot of input lately, and we actually do have a CB GraphQL module that we're working on. So we're trying to bring some GraphQL goodness into Cold Fusion. It's not prime time or ready yet, but we are working on it. Hopefully, we'll see by the end of the year or probably next year. But GraphQL is an interesting approach to building REST. I know REST sometimes can be rigid, but we're actually introducing a few things new. We actually released our ORM resource builder, which is GraphQL-like, and we're also going to be releasing that for quick for ORM. Because that way you don't even need a Java server to do GraphQL operations on response graphs. We're going to be building them through our quick and through the CBORM. So this will allow you to basically through the URI, basically have a little query language that you can do inclusions and exclusions very easily. So we're working on that, and it'll be there. But yeah, some people are big fans of GraphQL, some are not. I am still on the fence on some areas, right? It's yet another layer of technology that you need to add to and incorporate, right? But I know some people and some companies have made big investments on it. All right, welcome, man. Well, I actually recorded this as well via Zoom. I didn't know how good the recording from Adobe was going to be, so I did my own recording. We're actually streaming this live in YouTube as well, and I'll be adding this recording as well in CFcasts and other locations. But last chance, you have another question I can answer?
Okay, cool. So where we can see the recording, we can get the recording?
After this, I'm gonna upload it to Vimeo and to CFcasts, and I'll announce it through Twitter. So if you go to our Twitter handle, just follow us, you'll get the notification.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, if there's any other questions, just hit me up on Slack or hit me up through email and everything. But hope you enjoyed it, and check out the code, and thank you, appreciate it. All right, thanks, Luis. Bye, guys. Evagoras. Go to sleep, Evagoras.
Thank you.
Yeah, almost.